started in St. Lucia. So St. Lucia is known as the place where International Creole Month is stemmed from. So this new association in 1983 specifically declared October 28th as International Creole Day. So International Creole Month actually started as International Creole Day. And as time passed and the day got more and more recognition, they decided to make the entire month of August and recognize the whole of October as International Creole Month. So since then, cultures and countries everywhere um, have kept the observance of this specific celebration alive. So specifically in St. Lucia, it is recognized by displaying their ancestral artifacts, relics, products, clothing, and even material used by their ancestors.
Our English Creoles here are called dialect, while patois is mostly for French Creoles. Only Jamaicans refer to their English Creole as patois. These can be seen as elements of Caribbean history and culture. Some of the most common Creole lexifiers in the Caribbean are English, Portuguese, French, and Dutch. The UWI Linguistics Society seeks to highlight these elements from Creoles of different lexifying languages within Caribbean societies. Creoles are languages which emerge from multilingual situations. In the Caribbean, most Creoles were created from colonial expansions. Hence, the most common lexifiers are English, Portuguese, French, and Dutch. Creoles cannot only be classified by their lexifying languages, but also by their source languages, which would have contributed to their emergence. Creoles have their own phonological, morphological, syntactic, and semantic functions. Creoles are an important part of Caribbean culture since it is, in most cases, our first language. Some refer to our Creoles as bad language, broken English, or improper, but this is not so. Creoles are well formulated languages which are very complex, like any other languages. Some English lexified Creoles in the Caribbean are Bahamian English Creole, Bajan, Belizean, Guyanese, Jamaican Patois, English, Trinidad English Creole, Tobago English Creole, St. Kitts Creole. Some French lexified Creoles in the Caribbean are Antillean Creole French, Haitian Creole, St. Lucian French Creole, Trinidadian French Creole. And Portuguese lexified Creoles is Papiamento.
It is my fundamental belief that Creole should be recognized as official languages within the Caribbean. I'm not saying that we cannot speak English, French, Dutch, etc., but we should want to speak our Creoles with pride. It is who we are as a people. It is part of our identity, it's part of our culture, and it's part of our history. We have come from far to still accept Creole, to accept these colonial languages as our languages. We Creole people, we have so much to offer. And I think it's by time that we give our languages recognition and status. I am proud to speak Creole. And I would say, I think we need to spread a lot of awareness, and it will take everyone, it will take a holistic approach to recognize our languages. Our government official needs to recognize it not just in parliament, but need to speak it in terms of forums and speak at the United Nations and things like that. So as I said before, I'm proud. I need to do more for Creole languages. I thank you.
Yes, thank you again, Shakila. So now I'd just like to pass on you to, as I said, soon to be Dr. Ronald Francis, where he will give his great expertise in the field of French lexified Creole. I had the distinct pleasure of being one of his students um, last semester as well as semester one, and he was an excellent teacher. And I just want to just give a brief history of his let us say his study. As we all know, Mr. Ronald Francis is a student. He has a double major in both linguistics and Spanish with honors, which I give a great kudos to. His research, let us say, includes um, includes cross-linguistics transfer, lunar corporal, second language learning, Creole languages and music, Creole phonology, and Caribbean French lexicon Creoles. He's also a part-time assistant lecturer at the University of the West Indies. So as again, I welcome Mr. Ronald Francis to the floor. Thank you.
Right, thank you so much, Danilo. And I don't feel comfortable hearing my name mentioned with any kind of expertise next to Professor Robertson in the same Zoom meeting. um, but I'm very glad to share whatever I know about Creole languages, and I have a PowerPoint here, which I'm going to put up, and 15 minutes to do so. So I prepared something here that I am, I'm calling French lexicon Creoles a world view. Right? Can everybody see the screen? Can you just nod? Let me know that you're seeing. Let me know, Daniel. All right, great. Yeah, a world view. And I'm talking about worldview in two senses. So first, I want to just literally talk about where French lexicon Creoles are spoken in the world. In your invitation, you said that I should speak briefly about the structure. So I'll just do that very briefly. But more importantly, I want to talk about the philosophical worldview, which you touched on in your video, right? You specifically about why it matters and what type of worldview we should have as linguists. But because this presentation is for young, budding linguists, what type of worldview you should have as linguists coming up in the Caribbean towards French lexicon Creoles. The raw numbers themselves are staggering, and I don't think people know them. French lexicon Creoles can be found all over the world. It is the most widely spoken Creole in the Caribbean by far. So, for example, you have more than 35 million Creole speakers of all lexifiers in the Caribbean, and about 12 million of those speakers are French lexicon Creole speakers. 11 million or so of them are from Haiti, but we have speakers, of course, from different parts of the Caribbean, the insular Caribbean as well as the continental Caribbean. So we're talking about 12 point something million speakers in the Caribbean region alone, excluding places outside of the Caribbean. So for that reason alone, it means we should pay some attention to this language. All varieties of this language. In the insular Caribbean, we have Haiti, and of course, Haitians who are in the Dominican Republic, so that should be included. We have Guadeloupe and all of their dependencies, Martinique and St. Lucia, Dominica, Martinique, St. Lucia, and residual communities in Grenada and Trinidad. So when we talk about the insular Caribbean, the islands of the archipelago, that we basically have many different territories where French Creole is spoken. We also have French Creole territories in the continental Caribbean. So we have a St. Lucian community in Guyana, for example, and Prof perhaps can answer some questions on that later because he did some research on that. And then we have French Guyana as well, where French Creole is spoken. And then staying in the region of South America as well as Central America, in Brazil, you have Caripuna, right? You have French Creole spoken there. You have quite a few French Creole communities there. You have a mappa, which I don't know too much about. I mean, I have done some work on Caripuna. And then you even have smaller communities of people from Brazil and from Guyana and other parts of the Caribbean. So certain insulated French Creole communities in Venezuela and in Panama that have been documented and studied. In North America, we have Louisiana. So you have Louisiana French Creole. So that covers the entire America, all of the Americas as we know them, right? Including the Caribbean, which is part of the Americas. And then on the other side of the world, French lexicon Creole is also widely spoken. So in France, outside of French itself, it is the most widely spoken language regionally. Because you have many departments of France with different varieties of French lexicon Creole. You have many speakers of French lexicon Creole in France itself. So that is to be considered. We also have to consider Africa, the Pacific Ocean, as well as the Indian Ocean. So in Africa, there are historical, about two historical French pigeons. That's how it's recorded in the literature. But one right now that is still documented and is being studied um, in Burundi. And then we have the Indian Ocean close to Madagascar. That is where my map drop is there. Several islands that are departments of France or former colonies of France where French lexicon Creole is spoken. So Seychelles, Réunion, Mauritius, Rodriguez, etc. And then, of course, I put an arrow to show in the Pacific Ocean we have New Caledonia. So there's lots of information on all of these French Creole spoken um, on that side of the world. You can go to the Atlas of Pigeons and Creoles, for example, and get summaries there. Um, in terms of the structure of the language, we know that a lot of the Creole languages in the Caribbean are influenced, or even though we don't like the term substrata and so much anymore, but they are influenced by West African languages, or some of the languages that they came into contact with. European languages come into contact, as you rightfully mentioned in your intro video, into contact with West African languages. And what we will find if we compare, for example, the phonology of these languages, is that French Creole has a vowel system that includes about seven oral vowels. Generally, most French Creoles have about seven oral vowels. And these are the same vowels systems that you will find in the West African languages that are part of the origin of French Creole, right? In terms of the parents, so to speak, languages coming into contact. So they're less like the European lexifiers and more like the West African languages like Fongbe, etc., that influence it. And I just showed one table here to show that. In terms of of phonology as well, sorry, we also need to talk. French Creole has nasal phonemes. So in addition to our oral vowels, we also have nasal phonemes. And I have a clip here from the St. Lucian Creole Dictionary, edited by David Frank, where you have on, and right? So these are all nasal phonemes as well. And of course, when I say phonemes, just because we have some linguistic students here, just to make sure we are clear, I don't know if you remember your intro to phonetics and phonology, um, but you can form minimal pairs with these, right? So they will contrast in analogous and identical environments and form minimal pairs. So that's how we know that they are nasal phone, as opposed to English, for example, which has nasalization. So if I say the word like man, for example, there may be some nasal quality on the vowel sound there simply because it's surrounded by two nasal consonants. But we have distinct phonemes in French Creole that are nasal phonemes, that are vowels, nasal vowels. The most significant thing I would say there's just too much to talk about in terms of French Creole syntax. But I would say the first thing you will learn, and as Daniel rightfully mentioned, he did the course with me last year. The very first thing we will delve into is that if you're in terms of Creole syntax, is that nouns and verbs in Creole or in most Creole languages, they're always bare or they're always uninflected. So they're not inflected for number and there's no grammatical gender. And of course, grammatical information is marked by preposed or postposed particles. So you have, say, potla, for example, the cups, where the say will be the pluralizer, the la, of course, being the definite article. Can I have another example here, like motale, where the verb aller, go, is uninflected, and there's a preverbal marker, which can either mean progressive aspect, continuing aspect. It's continuing every single day. Right now, it's ongoing right now, imperfective. So I am going, or it can be recurring, right? So habitually, I go habitually. So where English marks that with inflection, and where English uses the present tense, for example, or that form of the verb, just the verb by itself to refer to habitual aspect, you have a preverbal marker referring to habitual or recurring aspect. So that's just a little bit of syntactic information about French Creoles. But the more important question, more than what is the structure of French Creoles and which I mean, so many linguists have studied, and where Creole languages are spoken around the world. Is why does all of this matter? Like why study this? And I think it's very important because French Creole indexes Caribbean identity. So historically, French Creole really is the language of freedom because Haiti was the first truly free and equal society in America. So you had the American War of Independence, for example, the Declaration of Independence, of course, drafted the famous words "We the People." I believe Thomas Jefferson, etc. But Haiti was the first society to proclaim every man equal, every single person equal. Right? There was no slavery, etc. When at the end of the Haitian Revolution, when Haiti took power from France. So really and truly, Haiti was a country that was with French lexicon Creole as its main language, Haitian Creole as the lingua franca, the language of the people, was in fact the language of freedom, the language of a society that was truly, truly free and equal. And in terms of our contemporary societies, French Creole is an indelible part, has made an indelible mark on our culture. You have many native speakers of French lexicon Creole in the Caribbean, and French lexicon Creole in many ways is connected to our way of life. So let's consider, for example, Trinidad. I know most of the students will be watching this presentation are from Trinidad and would have heard John Jacob Thomas. So he's a Trinidadian linguist, and he wrote the very first grammar of French lexicon Creole. And he did that because French lexicon Creole for a very long time, for almost a century really, was the lingua franca of Trinidad and Tobago. So well into the late 19th century, French lexicon Creole was the lingua franca and was spoken by people of every race in Trinidad and Tobago, more specifically Trinidad. And even though France never colonized Trinidad, there was immigration. So immigration was encouraged through the Spanish system, and as a result of that, immigrants from Saint Kitts and other parts of the Caribbean came in, and then you ended up with French lexicon Creole being the lingua franca of the island. So much so that the theory and practice of Creole grammar was written by John Jacob Thomas. So it is a part of our history. It's not so even in Trinidad right now, where there are only traces, for example, in Paramin, where it is kept alive, and some of you had the privilege of meeting some of these Creole speakers in Paramin last year. It is a part of your history and it is a part of your everyday speech right now, even though it's residual, like Mama Guy, etc. Your place names, um, the place names, and among other things. Of course, if you're speaking about Antillean identity, specifically the Lesser Antilles, French lexicon Creole connects Martinique and Guadeloupe, that are departments of France, to Saint Lucia and Dominica, that are independent, English official, but also have a French lexicon Creole. So in many ways, we share with Martinique and Guadeloupe, even though we don't have the same official languages. Even though Saint Lucians and Dominicans speak English is the official language of these two territories, and Martinique and Guadeloupe have French official. The connection between the two islands is kept by the language, a cultural connection between the two islands. And in many ways, it separates Martinique and Guadeloupe from France because Martinicans and residents of Guadeloupe, as well as all of the departments, can index their West Indian, their Antillean identities through French lexicon Creole and all of the permutations of that, like Zouk and the music, etc. And that gives them an independent West Indian identity, right? So there's a lot of literature on that. I must talk about Saint Lucia, of course, and Creole is by far and away the most patent index of what it means to be Saint Lucian in many ways of our cultural identity. It is part of our cultural forms, our folklore, like it is in many parts of the Caribbean, in Trinidad as well. And just one other example, flower festival, so La Rose and La Marguerite, for example. It's part of our music, so we have Zouk in addition to our folk songs, etc. We have Zouk, which we share with the French Antillean Islands, and then we also have Denry segment, right? We have Moto and Teddyson John, who was featured here on my slide, with things like Palais and Vent, two songs that were popular in Trinidad. That's why I put him here. because we have a lot of artists who are L1 speakers of French Creole who are creating music in the language and, in a way, revitalizing the language, revitalizing interest in the language as well. So, because French Creole is such a patent index of St. Lucian identity, infusing the language, creating music with the language, makes the music uniquely St. Lucian. Right? And we also have to consider the fact that in St. Lucia, especially people of the older generations, many of them, like my late grandmother, for example, are L1 speakers of French lexicon Creole. That is the dominant language. That is the language that she spoke. That was the language that she used every single day. And wherever possible, even in official interactions, wherever somebody would engage her, she would use them in official interactions. Right? So the question is why? Why does all of this matter? Well, now that we know the history, now that we know what it is, where do we go from there? What is the call for the Caribbean linguist? What's the call for you, for me, as somebody who's being groomed as a scholar in the area? Um, for Prof, for example, who has done so much work in the area, and for you, just studying and majoring in linguistics right now, or doing a minor in linguistics, it's because there is a sort of unspoken divide that happens when in a society there is one official language, but there are speakers, there are unofficial dialects or there are unofficial languages that are spoken by the speakers, um, who need access to public institutions. So, because only in Haiti, French lexicon Creole is official, and in all of the other territories in the Caribbean, French lexicon Creole is unofficial, even though it's part of the culture, it's a way of life. It has many L1 speakers. Um, these speakers need, especially if they do not have access in the official language, help. We need to create situations of not just equality but equity in which we provide them help to access public institutions. So we have to ask ourselves certain questions, um, questions, for example, about the education system. Are we considering the needs of L1 speakers of French lexicon Creoles in schools? And that's where my research comes in specifically. So what are the experiences of these speakers in the classroom or in standardized examinations in a situation where, for example, the island might be English official, but they have a French Creole competence. We need to think about, and of course, Michel Legraf, among and others, asked themselves that question in Haiti and came up with the very successful MIT Haiti initiative, in which students were taught even STEM programs and STEM courses like mathematics, science, etc., in their first language, which was Haitian Creole. And the results, we had an exponential increase in output in terms of results. So it is very important. We know for sure that it is important to have conversations about L1 speakers and of Creole and the experiences of L1 speakers of Creole in the classroom. Um, and it's particularly important, perhaps, in territories like Dominica and St. Lucia, where the official language is a different lexifier altogether. We also have to have conversation about medicine and health communication. So, can French lexicon Creole speakers explain their symptoms to their doctors? So, I have seen it myself. Because my mom worked at a hospital. I remember once, and I was waiting for her, and there was somebody speaking to a doctor who was foreign. He didn't speak English, and then another nurse had to come in and interpret what the person was experiencing. We saw that happen during COVID. So during COVID, when it became important for every single person in St. Lucia, for example, to know very clearly what was required and what was going on with this global pandemic, it became apparent immediately that they had to have interpreters, translators, giving the information in Creole to make sure that every single person was clear about what needed to be done. So after the Prime Minister's briefing and the briefing by the Chief Medical Officer, we had sitting Creole activists and French Creole interpreters giving all of the information again in French Creole. So it's important. It's really a matter of life and death in many situations. And then the law. So we can go on and on and on, but I will end with the law. So we need interpreters because there are many language rights. The law, for example, gives you the right to get the caution to have your rights read to you in a language that you understand. But in practice, there are many legal wrongs. In practice, an interpreter is not provided. It's left up to officers, for example, who see themselves as both officers but also interpreter because they speak the language to read the rights or to take statements, for example. And often these statements misrepresent what people have said. So I saw this again myself. I worked in a district court in St. Lucia, and I was waiting for I was translating. I translated from English to Spanish. That's what I did at the court, and I was waiting in the room to go up when my case was being heard to translate in Spanish. And there was a man speaking before me, just before me. The case before me, there was a man speaking, and he said he spoke in French Creole. He spoke in French Creole. He said something in French Creole, and then he was asked to say it again, and then he tried to say it in English, but he did not represent what he had said in French Creole accurately. And I knew this because I speak French Creole and I was listening, and I knew that he had not represented himself properly in English, and it's because he was struggling to represent himself properly in English. His first language, his mother tongue, his native language was very clearly French Creole. And I was sitting there thinking that the magistrate was Jamaican at the time, and the clerk, for example, interpreted for him in part. There was no official person in the role of interpreter. So in a way, his language rights were trumped by legal wrongs. So we need to have wider conversations about how French lexicon and Creole speakers um, experience our societies. And I could go on and on in the bank, etc. But I just want to end here because I only have 15 minutes. I thank you for giving me the opportunity to just speak briefly, even though I feel very unqualified, especially coming before Professor Robertson to speak about any of this. And I'm glad to take any of your questions.
Um, Thank you, Ronald, for that very informative and very insightful discussion. It was very, very inspiring, I must say. Well put together, well thought out presentation, and I have learned a lot. So I just want to say thank you for your time. Um, well, I guess we could probably have the questions after. You just want to have like a short game or just a short fun and facts, if I should put it like that. Um, and it goes like in terms of like looking at Trinidadian slang slash Creole, right? In terms of like what do you think is the Creole name for commotion or wild party?
Oh, you're asking me?
Yeah, well, anybody could answer the question, you know.
Well, I think it's comments, is it? Yeah.
Well, in Trinidad we say bacchanal.
Oh, Bacchanal. Oh, yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Another one is eggplant.
My God.
Yeah, correct. Excellent. Okay. Mano's upbringing.
That's brought up, see?
Yeah, correct. There. I guess that would be like D. I guess we say D in Trinidadian English Creole. In terms of party, we say fete in Trinidad. A noisy person is a mako, and I guess we could go on and on and on. But our next speaker we have is Professor Robertson, who I have great respect for in terms of his work and everything. I just want to say, I just want to welcome him as well as just give a brief history of who Professor Robertson is, as well as some of his work. So let me just give a brief history. Of course, he's from Guyana, educated from Queen's College in Guyana. He went to UWILS, Mona, graduated with honors, specials. He attained his PhD in linguistics, being the first, which is very significant. You know, his work experience include being a secondary school English teacher, as well as being the head of department, as well as being a temporary part-time lecturer at the University of the Western St. Augustine campus in English. He is also a senior lecturer at the University of Guyana, as well as a senior lecturer professor in linguistics at the Faculty of Humanities and Education. He was also the deputy dean there also, and eventually became dean of the faculty. He was also responsible for he was also the director, academic advisor for Evening University. He introduced things like the Bachelor of Education program, as well as the introduction of the field program, field methods, and linguistic course, cross campus UB, Introduction to Educational Linguistics, as well as designed and taught initial course in research methods in English department. Some of his research publications include Dutch Lexicon Creoles, English language teaching in Creole type communities, choices, secondary school textbook, designed for Caribbean schools, French lexicon Creoles, video documentation of various language experiences in the Caribbean. He also introduced regular local and regional field trip components into linguistics programs, as well as use of indigenous resources in Caribbean education, Caribbean oral traditions in education. And lastly, in terms of his public service, Ministry of Education, in terms of the CXC English language syllabus, he was also a member of the World Bank team on primary education programs for Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, Assistant Chief Examiner of CXC English Language, Chair Coordinator of CAPE, Communication Studies Syllabus, Developmental Panel Member. He was also the Secretary, Treasurer, Vice President, and President of the Caribbean Society for Caribbean Linguistics, as well as an honorary life member. With that being said, I'd like to welcome Professor Ian Robinson to speak about Dutch lexified Creoles.
Okay, thank you. And one of the problems with being asked to do a 15-minute presentation is that if you also ask me to give a summary of my life, I'm now 75 years old, and then you start putting that together, that alone takes up half of the time. And when I sent you that, I wanted you to just take out as much of it as possible. I have I know people like to give honorifics and so on, but my life is guided by the Creole concept that calabash now got handle. I don't know if you know what that means, but if you know the calabash growing on the tree, there's no handle on it in its natural state. There's no handle, so calabash not got handle. So all the honorifics don't really matter to me terribly much. And let me say that up front. But a number of things struck me, and I was tempted initially to do something like what Ronald did, but I thought it would probably be better for me to have a kind of conversation. Uh, Largely because much of my exposure and experience comes from the lived experience of the discipline. And I think that is very, very important for linguistics as a discipline. I listened to Ronald just now talk about disillusion issues in education. And those things are so fundamental and they're stretched right across our very being as Caribbean people that it is not easy for us to ignore them at all. Um, Incidentally, Ronald, in St. Martin, there's a group of people in St. Martin who speak French Creole very fluently. Okay? Um, because it's such a tiny island and because it is kind of off the beaten track, we often don't remember that. But the island of St. Martin is half French colonially and half Dutch. And they do speak their own kind of Creole language. Not their own, they speak the same uh, Les Antillean Creole. It's mutually intelligible. I've been there, spoken to them, and I know that they speak it normally. And they're very pleased and surprised when people from other parts of the region come up and speak to them in it. Anyway, my remit really is to talk a little bit about the Dutch Creoles and maybe a little bit about the French lexicon Creole experience. One of the interesting things about the Dutch as colonizers is that they were really much more into the slave trade at the crucial time than into the establishment of colonies. As a consequence, the only place where Dutch was documented to have been creolized, so to speak, prior to my work in Guyana, the only place where it was known to have happened in the region and parts in the world was in the uh, Danish West Indian islands of St. Thomas and St. John. And it's extremely interesting that the very first published Creole grammar was published by Megans in Copenhagen in 1770, which is a long time before people got into Creole studies in any serious way. And the thing about it is that document exists, and it exists alongside a number of translations of biblical and Christian work. Actually, so a lot of that kind of material existed, and it is important because, again, this was the Danish West Indies, in which you had a Dutch lexicon Creole referred to as Nick Hollands, uh, which is which developed in that territory, largely because of the population dominance or the socio-economic and political dominance of the Dutch in the island at a crucial point in the development of the region. Um, it is also important because that Creole language not only provided us with the first um, grammar, published grammar, but it also provided us with the first, with a range of translations and even a text, an attempt to, to teach in and through the Creole. So there's a little Creole AB book that was published at the time. Those things are still, they were 40 years ago, available in the library in St. Thomas, and I expect that they will still be available in St. Thomas even now. Uh, People who have worked on those things in recent times include uh, Bill Bradford, who used to be at the University of Puerto Rico, Robin Sabino, who used to be a very active member of the Society for Caribbean Linguistics. I can't quite remember where she is now, but she was somewhere in the mid-central US. And in more recent times, this Cephas van Rossum, who's in Cave Hill, working on the dictionary of the dictionary projects in Cave Hill. So that Creole existed and was known for a long time. One of the problems that we had was in the popular belief that Dutch was never creolized in the bad sense of the term creolized in a Dutch territory. Before I go any further, let me say I have a slightly different perspective on creolization and creoles from most people. Uh, and I feel that Creole is a way of life, and that it is that way of life that is reflected, especially in the semantics of the languages. Now, because most of the people who have studied these languages come from areas of the world where they can't enter readily into the ethos of Creole existence, they tend to drag us out into what I consider to be what I call linguistic minutiae. They like to talk about uh, preverbal particles, and they like to talk about the more oblique areas of phonology and so on. And it has led to a lot of misunderstanding of the nature of Creole languages and of Creole people. And part of the problem, Ronald, with the crucial French Creole and all the Creoles in the region, and their social acceptability has to do with the failure to understand Creole as a way of life. When you bring two Creole speakers together, regardless of their lexical differences and lexical backgrounds, they think and they behave in the same way and they understand things in the same way. You don't have to explain, you don't have to tell them things. You know, you say something in Jamaica and somebody in St. Lucia understands it. You say something in St. Lucia, and once they have a few of the words, they understand the sentiment. And that is, to my mind, that is at the heart of Creole studies. And one of the big failures, and it includes some of my work as well, is that we have not addressed that very central dimension of Creoles and Creolization. Creoles are much, much more a, a journal, a documentation of who we are as a people and who we have been. Bear in mind that there's nothing, the language could not exist if the people weren't there. All right. So it tells us about us in some very fundamental ways. And that is where I want to sort of make my pitch for the Creoles that I have been working on, well, the Creoles that were at the center of my early work. Berbice Dutch and another Dutch called Scapi Dutch. To understand it, you need to know that what is now Guyana and what is formerly British Guyana was originally, right from the outset, two colonies, one in the east called Berbice, the colony of Berbice, and one in the west called the colony of Essequibo. And subsequently, Demerara was developed out of Essequibo, so you ended up with three colonies. But the point I want to make is that Europeans understanding these, Europeans investigating and interrogating Creole languages, because they did not take the kind of Creole perspective which I just mentioned, often misunderstand and mischaracterize the situation in which they were working. Um, for instance, Derek Bickerton and Ian Hancock, first of all, suggested that the English lexicon Creole in Guyana developed probably from the Creole spoken in Suriname. Now, anybody who knows the countries would appreciate that that is virtually impossible given the large um, areas of dense, forested, and when not forested, waterlogged areas that people had to come across. So you're actually saying that some people who live in Paramaribo and the eastern end of Suriname impacted the Creole that was spoken, say, on the Essequibo. You know, you're talking a few hundred miles, and you're talking some big rivers, okay? Um, and you're talking a lot of swamp. And so, to because they didn't enter into the understanding of the nature of the place, they made all kinds of ridiculous statements. Now, Burmese Dutch uh, is itself exceedingly unique. When I first recorded, and I do have the very first audio recording and the very last video recording of Burmese Dutch, um, when I first recorded it in 1975, there were about 30 speakers left. I don't have to tell you that they were all dead. Okay? But the point is that they were all dead. And when, when I started looking at the language, I discovered that there's some really unique features which talk about the language. First of all, it is the only Creole language in the Caribbean, maybe in the world, but one with a West African link, where we could identify a very specific West African language. Uh, there was a if the words in Berbice Dutch for virtually all body parts. All right? Face, hand, mouth, tongue, water, drink, sleep, run. Those core items, God, they all come from Eastern Ijo, which is a Niger Delta language. All of them. It's not. So when people tell you that people couldn't speak and there was a mix up and they had to, you know, it is almost impossible to have had that language develop out of a vast range of West African languages. It was probably propagated later on in that way, but in its initial stages, it had to have been dominated by speakers of Eastern Ijo, and that we need to develop an understanding of. Why is that so unique? Even in Suriname and in Guyana, where people and in Jamaica, where people like to talk about the West African lexical bases, they're very restricted. More significant than all that, in Berbice Dutch, some of the inflections have been retained from Eastern Ijo. Two important things. One, we tend to talk about simplification. And when we talk about simplification, we talk about simplification of the European language, with loss of inflections, and we don't have plurals, and we don't have this, that, and the other. In Burmese Dutch, yes, the plurals have been leveled, and the suffix for pluralization, it is a suffix, it derives from Eastern Ijo, but only from one particular type of pronoun of noun in Eastern Ijo. So that means that the whole system, which was very complex in Eastern Ijo, was retained only in one form or was reduced to one form. So when we talk about creoles and reduction, we need to think about the substrate. I know no, people don't like to talk about substrate, but they don't like to talk about substrate because they don't understand it and they don't recognize the implications of it. So when I can say to you, listen, the past marker in or the perfective marker in Berbice Dutch is from Eastern Ijo. Now, while I'm saying this, all the other forms are pretty much in sync with the remainder of the creoles of the region. And what Berbice Dutch does is gives you opportunity to see the significance of that, to look at to fill in gaps in the history. Incidentally, there are no historical documents on that period in Berbice. So the language is what retains that history. And the language that tells us what happened in the country at that time. And that for me is very, very, very significant. Um, I know I can go on and on, but just jumping forward to Essequibo, Essequibo Dutch is known as Scapi Dutch. And I was just last night reading a new article which has been published by a couple of guys, Pavel and somebody else. It turns out that when I started working on Berbice Dutch, on Berbice Dutch, one of my informants told me there was another Dutch in the Essequibo, and I went down and went and I found very residual knowledge of it. There was a lady who could give me a long list. She could give me all the items I wanted. Unfortunately, I shared that. I gave that tape to a friend of mine in St. Thomas for him to make a copy to compare with Nigger Holland's. And now, 50 years later, he's not returned it to me. He's giving me every excuse and he doesn't even answer me now. So I've lost track of the very first and the most informative set of data because, again, I assumed that in my naivety, I was a young man at the time. I gave it to my partner and he could deal with it and give it back to me. Never came back. But the important thing about it is that that Creole is more closely aligned to Nika Hollands than it is to Berbice Dutch, which tells you another thing. You have two colonies right next door to one another, and you have a third one across the ocean, and it's the third one that has the link. So you now have to start looking at the kind of socio-historical connections between those two sets of places. So um, it's an extremely complex way of 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 um of dealing with the day-to-day existence in these countries. Um, Now, I could go on and on, but I really don't want to do that. I want to just make maybe two or three other points. One of them, uh, Ronald, in 1763, there was a rebellion of the slaves in the Burmese colony. Oh, incidentally, the reason people didn't find this, once again, is the naivete. Um, the, 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 the Dutch settled upriver, the British settled on the coast. By the time the British came, the Dutch had moved on to the coast. So everybody's looking for Dutch girl on the coast, but the Dutch never really settled the coast. So these people were up in the interior, 100 miles up the river, all right, and they're looking for them on the coastline. See, that doesn't make any sense. But you only know that if you are prepared to be open-minded and broad-minded, all right? And if you don't want to rush into print and say, all right, I discovered that Ghana has an English Creole which looks like Suriname. Absolute rubbish. The Guyanese English Creole, incidentally, is um, mutually intelligible with Tobagonian and Vincentian. Absolutely no difficulty. If you put the three of them in the same room, except for a little bit of phonetics and phonology, you're in good company. You have no problem. There are even ones remember using an obscene term in the presence of a Tobagonian young lady. And when she kind of reacted to it, I said, "You know that word?" And she sheepishly admitted that she did. All right. Couldn't believe that there was that level of similarity. Anyway, so that's the first thing, one of the things that I want to close on. Um, the issue of Burmese having had a slave rebellion in 1763, well, this is where it's going. And although that rebellion did not last, it preceded the Haitian rebellion by nearly 30 years. And it it closed, it brought an end to the Dutch upriver colonies. The slaves took over the colony. There's an exchange of letters which I'm about to translate from English back into Burmese Dutch. An exchange of letters between the leader of the rebellion and the Dutch governor. Right? Telling him, listen, you could keep the coast if you want, but we staying in here and you can't come back here. Whatever it was. Of course, they were outmaneuvered after a year. But the troops had to come from Europe to put that rebellion down. All right? So, um, again, the notion of how these things happen becomes important. The second thing about Burmese Dutch is that it gives an excellent window into the processes of language death. Because, like I said, I met 30 people speaking the thing, they're all dead now. And even as the very last speaker, with whom I did a number of videos, um, she, I could virtually trace her losing the language. Well, not losing the language, but her dying. And on the last visit I paid her, she's crying and saying, well, she's so sorry she couldn't be here long enough to tell me more about the language and in the language. Okay. So the issue of language death is important. The other thing is the impact of the colonial education system, I should say systems, on these languages and the people who spoke it. There was English, once English became official, it made all these Creole languages, well, it's not just, yes, it made them exceedingly um, totally rejected in the education context. This is repeating what you said, Ronald. And I can tell you that when I was working in St. Lucia many years ago, not working, I was on a consultancy in St. Lucia. And when I told the PermSec in Ministry of Education that the children spoke Creole in the school, he said, no, nobody speaks Creole in the school. And I said, well, maybe, but what I heard was Creole. Maybe they don't speak it, but I certainly heard it. Right? And I left them at that. But you get to the stage where, the education system itself so actively prevents it. And in the case of Babis, there's documented evidence, and one of my informants also told me that they were not allowed to speak in Creole, in Burmese Dutch, in the classroom. But all the parents spoke it, the grandmother spoke it, the aunt and the uncle spoke it. So that um, there's a lot to be said for that. I will close on one thing, because I know I've been talking already too long. I will close on one thing though. For me, language lives in the field. Language does not live in the textbooks. Textbooks represent some kind of distilled version, often guided by theoretical underpinnings which are inaccurate, often um, guided by sociocultural and psychological understandings which are not necessarily in sync with the reality. And therefore, the challenge to young linguists, at 75 I can say this, the challenge to young linguists is to begin to chart to identify and to chart the directions which give real relevance and real meaning and real understanding to these languages which are a fundamental part of our being. Too often we are told what these languages are, and too often we buy into that, and too often we pay the price, whether it is in the medical field or in the education field or in the legal field or in any of the other fields. And we allow ourselves then to be reduced to use the biblical, what you call it, hewers of wood and bringers of water, right? Mere curios. Right? They speak a quaint language down there. Uh, I didn't say anything about the French Creole because we all not talked about that, but I also did a considerable amount of work among the French lexicon Creole speakers in Guyana. In fact, I learned to speak it from them. Uh, it is in Guyana that I developed some kind of competence in French Creole. So the other thing about Burmese Dutch is that it also allows me to trace how I developed competence in the language because, of course, I did not know the language. Well, I didn't even know the language existed. I just believed it did. And I was challenging Bickerton's position that it didn't. Okay, and that led me to go look for it. So, there's a lot in there. But I've been going on, and it is time for an old man to shut up and let the young people take over.
So thank you, Ronald and Professor Robinson. I'm not sure if Daniel has any questions for us. I'll leave him to ask his questions first, and then I have a question.
Well, I certainly have questions that I could engage Prof in. Um, if we want to engage Prof in conversation, I was just noting a few things while Prof was speaking, and I don't know how much time we have, but perhaps it would be useful if we pick Prof's brain a little bit, um, you know, on some matters here. What do you think about that, Shakila?
Sure. Sure, you can go ahead and ask the question.
Yeah. So, Prof, you were speaking when you were speaking, and that is something that I am conflicted about. So I want to ask maybe three types of questions, but one to deal with But I want to start with the academic side, especially because we have so many young linguists here. Um, I remember I was at a conference abroad once, and then I was speaking about the importance of making sure that in whatever group of people you have going out into the field, you have someone who's really tethered to the community in a way. You have a scholar who's very tethered to the community. And you were speaking about semantics and us being able to understand prebabble particles, etc., having all the syntactic theories that we can use to describe our languages. But I've seen it in my own work, for example, that I often think that things make sense to me simply because I speak the language and then I look at it. I understand that for example, the semantic breadth of a word has in English, for example, has increased in its use in Saint Lucia because it has a sort of broader the equivalent in French Creole has a broader meaning, a more encompassing meaning. That is covered in English Creoles in the Caribbean. Garrett spoke a little bit about that, about semantic shift in his article when he looked at vernacular English of Saint Lucia, for example. So I say all of that to say, what is your position as somebody who has not just been a scholar, but also an administrator of so many students, as a former dean and senior lecturer? You basically half of the linguists in the Caribbean were supervised by you, and as somebody who has really gone out into the field. I mean, what is your position on who should engage these communities, and what type of strategy we should have as scholars going into these communities to make sure that we're not just talking about prefrontal particles and phonological theories, etc., but we're also getting the life, the understanding that you mentioned, Creole as society, Creole as existence. That was a long-winded question, but I think you get the point I was making.
All right, let me respond to that because there are a number of issues in there that I want to respond to. I'll try to do it very quickly. One of them is who should engage with them. I say somebody who's prepared to listen. There's a need for a humility when you go into the field because you don't know. Let me give you a personal experience. I once took well, I can give you several. When I first discovered Burmese, because I made a list and type up the list and so on, old Gestetner days, and I put some nice covers and I carried it in the river and I shared it with some people. The next time I went back, one of the informants came to me and he said, I see you try to spell them things, but you spell it wrong. You hear that? No. I could have said, but look, I'm a linguist, and what I have there is Cassidy on the page. How you could tell me I spelled it wrong? Where would that have taken me as a linguist? What would I have understood about that man's position on the nature of how the language should be set down? Absolutely nothing. So that kind of arrogance is something that we have to learn to deal with. So in the first instance, you go into the field, I always remember a man giving me something to drink we call it high wine in Guyana. It's like punchin. Now when you pour this, for the first time I went, he said to me, when I like you have a nice spirit and thing. His wife was a fluent speaker and my best informant. And he says, when you come, when I drink it, now you're gonna have to drink. So I go there this day and this man gives me this thing. No, I'm not a drinker. And I drink, courtesy drink. When I poured that thing down my throat, it did not go down. The thing evaporated in my mouth. Right? It was like if you put methylated spirits on the skin and just blew it. Right? And that man drank that thing straight, and I had to drink it straight too. And then he poured some water from a goblet he had, and he drank that, and I drank it too. But I could have said, I don't do that kind of thing. I'm not a drinker. All right? I can tell you a lot of field stories like that I think are important. So, in the first place, I think you need to be humble. You need to be prepared to recognize that the people out there live in the school of life, what I call the laboratory of life. And that provides an education that no amount of classroom could fully replicate. Okay? So you're asking me who should engage them. I said, if you're going, just be humble, just be prepared to listen, just be prepared to work with them. Be tolerant. If you go in there with your pre-designed lists, and so often we used to have students coming, and some of my colleagues, they would come with a prepared list, and they want to find out, um, give me a series of sentences with, I don't know, unrealized possibilities, so I can check to see how you say that. My thing is collect the data and let the data speak to you, and then ask the questions having collected the data. But don't go there with the kinds of interest that you have and impose it on the data because people will tell you what you want to hear. I've seen it happen so very often.
Well, there's a resurgence of that, Prof, happening. Well, going back to spontaneous data, I remember when we went on our trip to Guyana and Suriname, remember your instruction to us was just speak to the people and record, right? So just speak to them and record, and it wasn't. And I certainly have seen it myself trying to collect data that when you solicit, when you do grammar elicitation, sorry, not solicit, but grammar elicitation, for example, you get very specific responses that are different to spontaneous speaking when you just sort of engage and then you record. So is that your recommendation for fieldwork? That it's just about living with the communities and just recording spontaneously and forgetting elicitation altogether?
Yes, you also need a good memory, yeah? Need a good memory because you hear something and you have to remember what you heard so that when the opportunity comes, you can ask about it. You can interrogate it. But you don't start off by asking up front because you'll get what you feel you should get.
Yeah.
You really want them to sort of take you there. So there's that to it as well. It's a long answer, but then it's a complex issue that you raise. So
Yeah. I don't know if Shakila and Daniel have another question. Do you?
Well, I do have a question. My
Okay.
question would be with regard to those Creoles in the region that are, I don't want to say dying, but there's a minority group of speakers. And we see the younger generation not taking it as seriously to learn these languages and carry on the culture within their societies of learning the Creole languages. So my question is to either of you, what are some suggestions in terms of encouraging persons to learn the languages? Because even with Trinidadian French Creole, we see that the speakers are really secluded to certain places within Trinidad, and that the younger generation, there's very few young persons that speak the language because they're really not interested in it. They don't see any reasoning for speaking Trinidadian French Creole. So, if there's any advice to them,
Well, I don't know if Prof
well,
wants to
no,
answer, but my advice would just be to teach it, huh?
I was thinking of probably having an institution because I don't think that we have a registered institution that actually teaches Trinidadian French Creole or anywhere in the region that has these languages that are not really spoken other than in their minority groups. So I think
Well,
it's
you have a lot of teaching going on. Like now, there's teaching happening at South Louis Community College in St. Lucia, and of course, a lot of work happening with the Folk Research Center in St. Lucia. And you have the course at UWI, which Daniel did. I'm not sure if you did it, but you might have done it with a different lecturer. Yeah. But what I find, which is always interesting, and Prof actually mentioned this, and I wrote this down. I was going to talk to him about that if we had time, is that when you bring Creole speakers from different places together, they just get it. So that when you start teaching, when I'm teaching French Creole here at UE, and you have Trinidadian speakers, etc., who speak Trinidadian English Creole, Very few of them already have any kind of background in French Creole, as you said, because young people don't really speak it. It clicks right away. And there's something about the underlying grammar that perhaps they all share. So, for example, if you say something like "Mwekale," meaning I'm going, a Trinidadian might be able to identify with "I just go," something like that, where you have a preverbal marker. Maybe that's the case. Or I don't know what it is. My hypothesis is that it's about substrata. It's about the fact that you have you have some kind of competence that already matches the type of grammar that you're learning, and so it becomes a little bit easier. But within a few weeks, a certain type of fluency develops, and students learn it, they pick it up very quickly. And I think that is all we need to do. I think if we put the Creole back into our culture, we put it back into music the way it's happening in Saint Lucia right now. We're teaching it. We make it an imperative at universities, like the way it's an imperative to do a Caribbean language as part of your linguistics program. It should be a wider imperative. You know what I mean? Perhaps a faculty imperative or something of that nature, so that as soon as people begin to engage it, they will be engaging something that's already innate, already a part of themselves. Because I see it in my own classrooms. I don't know if Prof wants to add to that.
Yes, that's important. Incidentally, again, you're really talking about what I meant, what I spoke about, and I said, there's an essential Creoleness about the way of life, which is what is common and which allows you to easily enter into these understandings across the board. I think, too, that we need to recognize the communities and deal with them. I tell you something. When I moved from the Faculty of Education back in '94 to go back into linguistics in Arts and General Studies as it was at the time, there were two separate faculties then. Education was a faculty and Arts and General Studies was a faculty. And I was in education and I switched to Arts and General Studies. And when I went there, I started off by teaching. Oh, just a minute for me, please. Hello?
Hi, Dad. How are you?
Hi. Chris, can I call you back?
Yes, certainly.
Okay. Yes. Sorry. Guess my granddaughter wanted to talk to me. Yeah. But when I switched, one of the things I did was to take people to Paramin. I think it was the first time that people in linguistics went anywhere. People in that class included Namdi Hodge. Um, Sandra was in that class, but she didn't go on that field trip. Ronald Cato, who subsequently worked in Martinique for years. Um, and then after that, we went to, and the people there welcomed us. They were glad to see us. Then we went down to Grand Chemin in Deep South, deep South, right? Way down on the bottom of Maruga. And we met about 30, 40 people, older people who were still there alive and speaking the language. I invited them up to campus. And again, that was the first French Creole Day. We had all these patois speakers come up onto the campus. And there was an old lady there walking, and I offered her a ride in my car. We were going to lunch. And she said, "Who, me?" No. I only hear that this place had a university. I never see it yet. I have to walk on this university. She had a link that for me was so important. And that, I think, is really what's going to help us. Let us get back to those communities and keep them going. Um, the Creole Day, which we used to have, when Sandra first started that course, and we put out the newspaper. I don't know how many of you have seen that newsletter. It's the year Brian Lara left cricket. And the headline was Brian Lara Kakite Cricket. And it's the year that V.S. Naipaul visited campus. It was beautifully done by a number of students who, in a year, were able to put out a newspaper entirely in French Mexican Creole. So we've got to meet people and respect them and encourage them. I think the young people at the time developed a real interest in it. And I certainly think the biggest thing that happened for me in linguistics in my time was getting into the field, going into field trips. Though, I mean, I used to do 5 field trips a year sometimes. Curacao, Jamaica, Guyana by 3 or 4. Suriname. Very necessary. So, long answer, but we need sustained contact. And I have gone to the Burbage River and met a young man who asked me if I wouldn't come into the river to teach them the language. Now, that is 140 miles up a river. That is for when I was 30 years old. I'm not going there in my 70s to batter my whole body to get up there to teach them the language. But now he wants to learn it.
That's what Daniel to do now.
That's right. Well, that's where I'm heading, really, you know. That is really the answer to our question. You take it up. That's the challenge. Okay?
Daniel, you have a question?
Yeah, I just want to know this one question, right? Like, what made you have such a peak interest in languages, or what made you become a linguist?
I was teaching in a secondary school in Guyana and not doing too bad as a teacher, if I might say so. But I recognized that there's a problem that I didn't understand. And I could not wrap my head around the problem. So I decided I would go do a diploma in education. And I wrote to Dennis Craig, who was then in Mona, and he responded saying, listen, that's a roundabout way. Go into linguistics and get it that way. Get it from that perspective. So really, it is applied linguistics that drew me into linguistics. And I became a Creolist because my mind is one that doesn't necessarily accept things people tell me. And in fact, one of my problems with the early linguistics was that I read I think John Kyle was his name, saying some nonsense. He's a big psychologist, saying some nonsense about first children learn to speak language more quickly and more fluently because they are the only child and they have the focus of the parents. I happen to come from a family of 14 children, siblings. And I said to them, I said to my supervisor, I said, that is nonsense. But I know the difference looking, and I'm up at the top. You know, like 2 before me, and then me, I'm the third in the 14. And I can look and tell you all the differences with my brothers and sisters after me. And it had nothing to do with who was no more at home and who was what. Nothing at all. So that sense of an unwillingness and rebellion, if you want to call it that, an unwillingness to accept the orthodoxy, I think is also important. You need to challenge. You need to ask the right questions. Don't be afraid to do that. Tell me I'm talking nonsense. That's fine.
All right, just one more question. This last question. What can we do, right, if our governments, right, don't want to, like, let's just say, give Creole languages recognition? They want to keep with the colonial languages. Let's just say the French, the Dutch, the English. what can we do if our government don't want to recognize the Creole languages from our point of from our standard?
Well, the standard answer, the stock answer would be educate them, right?
Right.
Now, that is not easy
Correct.
because you educate one set and then the government will change and you have to educate another set. And people have their entrenched positions. Um, I came into linguistics in 1971, and the question you just asked was the question we were asking in 1971. It's now 50 years later, well, 49 if you want to be specific, and you're still asking the same question. What is important is to develop a more comprehensive group of knowledgeable people. I'll tell you a little secret now since I have your ear. I chaired the committee that prepared the syllabus for Cape Communication Studies. Module 2 is the Language and Society module. I had to fight everybody except the three people who were in my group. Incidentally, there was this inclusion in that group. What's her name? Veronica Simon. You know her, Ronald?
Well, not personally, but I would have, yes.
Yeah, she was in the group. It was she, a Jamaican lady who was also very grumpy, and one other lady from Guyana who was living and work, who still lives and works in Antigua. But I had to fight for that. And I insisted that we must have that section. And I insisted that we must have a section that had to do with Creole. I don't know what they've done with it, but I know that they watered it down afterwards. Because my intention was to ensure that the school system, and if there's anything I'm proud of, it's how I've impacted the school system. I wanted to be sure that teachers of English had to know something about languages and had to know something about Creole and had to develop an awareness. Um, and I conceded one or two things, but I insisted that the teachers of English must have that skill. Let me tell you, the 18 years ago, 16 years ago, you would not have been appointed a teacher of English if you had a BA in linguistics. No way. No way. Every teacher of English did the literature degree. And that thing was self-perpetuating. So all the officials came through literature. And they all insisted that you must do literature. And it was a big fight. And I can tell you the people who were involved in helping us to get past that. Professor Yusuf was part of my team, but also Desiree Augustine, who is now in School of Education. She was the curriculum officer English in the ministry at the time. And it took us a while until we got them to agree to ensure that people who were teaching English had a particular orientation in linguistics. And that also allowed me to introduce, as Dean, language linguistics with education as an offering. Because that is the offering that really speaks to the teachers, or should speak to them. I don't know what happens now, because I haven't been staying in touch with it. But the point
it's still a requirement. It's still a requirement.
Yeah, the intention, but it wasn't all along. I mean, that is because we had to actually work for it now. Let us say from 71 to 2000, that was the battle we were fighting. So it will not be over tomorrow, but you have to keep at it. Stick to itiveness is what is important.
I know that you had written a sort of, I don't know if it was drafted, if it a sort of language policy,
Yes.
and I'm not sure what's the latest on that. Was it
I,
difficult?
I myself am not sure what's the latest because what happened was that I was asked to do a language policy document. I had a number of consultations across Trinidad and Tobago. And I drafted the document and sent it to them and said, listen, we need to look at this document and analyze it and whatever. Two things happened. Suddenly, I saw somebody quoting Robertson 2010 or whatever it was. And I said, what is this you're quoting? To somebody whose work I was supervising. And she said, the Ministry of Education policy document. I said, what? So that document, this is aligned with the ministry, is a document that was supposed to be a draft for discussion. Worse than that, and it follows much of what I've been saying. But worse than that, the government then changed in that same year. And they got a new Minister of Education, that medical doctor, what's his name? He was in Bono in my time too. Gopal. What's his name? Anyway, the Minister of Education before the current ministers, before not this year, before 2015 said, Gopi Singh. Um, he came into power and he didn't seem to have any interest in it. I think he was led or misled by a guy who was writing in the newspapers again now, who had done a debate with me and who was very kind of um, underinformed, like a bad film, overexposed and underinformed. But he seemed to have been his advisor. Well, the others wouldn't be able to understand that metaphor. But those of us who know the old days of the photography of the old film where you had to develop it and so on, it's underdeveloped and overexposed. And I think that was his problem. And so he was advising the minister, and the minister was taking him on. So I don't know. I don't think anything has ever happened to that policy other than it's been on the ministry's website. I would have loved. I'm not sure if I still love to. I would have loved to be able to flesh it out in much more detail and to see how teachers react to it. Because again, I believe that the people at the operational end are critical to success in issues like that. And I could sit down in the university and talk how much I want. If they don't intend to take me on, it's not going any place. And the experience of the Jamaica language unit trying to do a bilingual program in Jamaica and things, official ministry accepted it, and then boom, another government comes in and that's it. They toss it out.
Yeah.
So it's long and complex.
Long and complex indeed. We were supposed to be talking for an hour and a half, so I'm not sure. The our moderators have to let us know.
I was saying it's over 2 hours and a half already.
Well, I believe if y'all don't have any more questions, we could end it off there. Unless Ronald has one more question. I know he said he had 3 questions, and I believe he asked 2.
Well, I mean, I can always have conversations with Prof. Conversations with Prof can go on for a while. So many, as he said, he's talking about 50 years. He's talking about 50 years of work in the field. So conversations with Prof will always go on. I can never forget. I was talking to Prof about something I read a long time ago. And I said I saw a paper. There was this paper by by Carrington back in, I think it was 1969 or whatever the case may be, and he's like, "Oh, I have a copy of that." And then
1968.
yeah, and one of the original prints out of the. So it's been Prof has been at it a while. So this conversation could go on for days.
True, true.
I was lucky to Lawrence Carrington was my PhD supervisor.
Yes. Yeah. And he wrote the grammar of Saint Lucian French Creole.
That's right. That's
Yeah.
right.
Well,
And the Mondesi Dictionary.
I mean, I really wish I could be there one day in terms of the knowledge and all of that. But thank you very much, Professor Ian and Ronald. We really appreciate the content that you all brought to us today. And also for those that are still looking via YouTube, because we did get it to stream. I mean, they were not seeing, but I saw a few of them were looking at the session. So thank you all for looking on. You can look forward to the actual videos soon. I will edit them and post them. Um, but thank you very much. I really appreciate it. I really appreciate your patience through all the technical difficulties and all of that. I am still adapting to the online environment. I'm not really too tech savvy. I mean, I am young, but
Well, if you're now adapting, what do you think about an antediluvian relic like me?
It is it is challenging. It's very, very challenging, I think. And it takes a certain amount of patience.
yes,
But
it
it's
does.
also
I mean,
exciting, yeah?
Mm.
sometimes, the internet drops unexpectedly and all of these minor things that we don't account for. But thank you very much for your patience, your time, and all of the information that you shared with us today.
Okay, well, thank you all for getting me involved. Every so often it helps to kind of